Welcome to the Simply Biblical Podcast. My name is Jonathan McAtee, and I'm joined by my co-host, Nick Stallone. How you doing, Nick?
I'm good, John. Just got back from Pennsylvania. Had a wedding. My aunt got married this past weekend, so got to celebrate that with her. It was good. It was fun.
Sweet. This week
How are you doing?
I'm doing great.
Sorry.
You're good. Doing good. I get to see my nephew this week, and so I'm super excited about that. Uh, Pumped to hold a baby. I have not held many babies in my life, but I'm excited to hold this one. But I was gonna say, this week I listened to part of one of our last episodes, and I realized that every single week we say, how you doing? Like the same way. And we did not plan that from the beginning, but then it just kind of happened and it stuck. I thought that was kind of funny that it's just something we do. Everyone, every
hmm
week, they
Just a
get a
habit.
little update on our lives. Not that they
hmm
asked for it, but you're welcome,
No,
everyone.
not at all. Yeah. And then also we apologize for the delay in our previous episode. We're moving on to a new platform. We were previously on Async and now we're moving to Riverside, and we just ran into a couple more complications than we expected in the process of just moving everything over. So again, apologize for that. Shouldn't happen again. We should be back to our regular schedule.
Yes.
But yeah, today we are kickstarting our new series on other religions. And really, the goal, the idea is just to learn about other religions. I feel like we can kind of just get stuck in our bubble of Christianity and only learn about Christianity, which is good, but it's also good to sharpen up on some of the other things that are going on in the world so that when we do come across someone of another faith, of another religion, we can have conversation, discourse about what the other believes and not just feel totally taken aback or caught off guard in those moments. And also, I do want to preface the goal of this isn't just to win an argument or be able to disprove someone else's religion. The moment that you try to win an argument, you lose immediately. The goal isn't to do that. The goal is to, with relationship, be able to build trust and be able to, walk someone closer to Jesus step by step as they just work it out themselves. So our whole idea of this isn't to, again, to disprove or win you an argument when you come across another religion on the street or anything like that. We just want to help educate and also help, yeah, just help your discourse with those people. But the ultimate goal is not to win an argument. The ultimate goal is to win relationally, and then hopefully that will lead them closer to Jesus as they see the fruit of Jesus lived out in your life. And yeah, so anything that you'd like to add to that, John?
Not a bunch, but it is interesting. We're talking about other religions. We did a poll on Instagram and this one won. To be honest, I voted against this one, but here we are. Um, but honestly, we're simply biblical, and so we're going to come at it from a biblical perspective, of course.
hmm
And we're not experts on these religions. I'm sure there's tons and tons and tons of people who know a lot than us. But we thought we'd give a little bit of history, kind of how we're going to do it for these religions, give a little bit of history, talk about their beliefs, and then go into some differences and maybe some similarities to Christianity. And then at the end, talk about how would you witness to someone of this religion. And that can be helpful because, like in scripture, people, Paul, Peter, these guys didn't witness the exact same way to every single person. They would change it depending on who they're talking to, emphasize different aspects of Jesus or aspects of the gospel, and so that can help as we're talking with people from a different religion and even culture. It's a good idea to have their culture in mind, their point of view in mind when you're talking to them about Jesus, so that way they can receive in the best way, and that you don't have to be fighting their culture and their religion, but you can just maybe even use their culture to bring Jesus into it and share how he can change their life and things like that. So that's kind of where we're coming from and where we're going in this series. We don't know exactly how many episodes we're going to have in this series, but talking about a few different religions, and I'm excited about what's ahead. And today we get to start out with Judaism. And so, starting with something that's probably a little bit more familiar to us, obviously, just because we share a lot of our scriptures. But so, to start, I guess, do you have anything else to add before we get started, Nick?
No, we can jump right into it.
Okay. So, just a little bit of history. Of course, the origins, it is the oldest monotheistic religion still practiced today, meaning that they worship one God. Of course, we know that as simply biblical. And it traces its origins to God's covenant with Abraham. Somewhere around 2000 BC, God made the covenant with Abraham to bless all nations through him and his offspring. And he promised descendants, land, and that all nations would be blessed, like it talks about in Genesis chapter 12. Some major figures, of course, Abraham, who's the father of the Jewish people. There's Isaac, his son, and Jacob, later named Israel, which of course is, they're called the Israelites. And then Moses. Moses is huge, especially since he wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, called the Torah, and they love them some Moses. You can see that throughout Scripture that Jesus would talk about, Moses gave you the law, and Moses, 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 all over the place. Moses is huge. And then David, of course, was their king of Israel, the second king of Israel, who is a huge figure, of course. And then Solomon, David's son, built the first temple. And we're going to talk about the temples a little bit today. Would you like to cover the important events?
Yeah, yeah. And again, these are going to sound very similar just because we've read about them, learned about them pretty much throughout our whole lives if you grew up as a Christian. And, if you're new to your faith, you're probably reading these as you learn and more about God and more about our history. But also, I just want to point out David is another super important figure because he's also the Messiah is promised to come through his lineage. And that's why,
Yeah.
when Jesus is referenced as son of David, it is so important that um, so important for that to be said, not just, it's not just saying it just to say it, but that is why, the reason why is because the Messiah was promised through his lineage. And so, yeah, but getting into some of the important events, we got the Exodus from Egypt when they were running from Pharaoh, again with Moses, back to the guy that they love. And then giving up the law, another Moses moment, Mount Sinai. Then we have the kingdom of Israel when they were finally established. And then you have the Babylonian exile, where Babylon kind of took over them. And then we have the return to Jerusalem, where they fled, they were freed from Babylon, returned back to Jerusalem. Then the second temple period, and then we have the destruction of the second temple in AD 70. And I'm going to pass it on to John here because he's done a lot more studying beyond this portion than I have. So let's hear it, John.
Well, yeah, so we know a lot about those important events, of course, when we're reading our own Bible and things like that. But so I wanted to talk about some of the things that we don't know as much about as Christians, and that would be the Second Temple period, meaning that, well, the first temple was built by Solomon, like we said earlier, and then that was destroyed by Babylon in the 500s BC. And then when they came back to Jerusalem, they rebuilt the temple. And so that would be the second temple. 1, 2. Yeah, that's pretty good. And so then that temple, the second temple, lasted all the way to 70 AD, where it was destroyed by the Romans. And so this period, this point in history, a lot of it is not covered in our Protestant scriptures. You had the Maccabean revolt against the current invaders. They were always being conquered and things like that. But let me get to where we're starting off. So in the 160s BC, and I won't go into extreme detail, they were ruled by the Seleucids, Israel was, and Antiochus Epiphanes, the king of Syria, was persecuting the Jews. And in the temple, he set up an altar to Zeus and sacrificed a pig on the altar. And so obviously that was a huge no-no. You don't do that in the temple of God. And so that was a major spot. So then, in response to that, some Jews led by Judah the Maccabee led the Maccabean revolt, and they reconquered the territory and purified the temple. And then in 63 BC, some time is moving on. Rome took over with the help of some corrupt priests and political strife. So in between that time, there was the Maccabean revolt. They set up a new monarchy, and they had some freedom for about 100 years, which is quite a long time, until the Romans came in and they took over. And then that's when we get to, around the time of Jesus. Rome is in charge, and they're ruling everything. And then that leads all the way to 66 AD, where some Jews rebelled against Rome and had a few early victories, but then the Rome came in and wiped them out. And by 70 AD, they destroyed the Second Temple, and they claimed their victory over Jerusalem. And so during that time, Judaism split into, well, there's probably more than just four, but these four major groups or parties. And one was the Sadducees, which we see in Scripture. They were the priestly class that worked the temple and things like that. Their response to this Roman and Greco-Roman culture was kind of to use it to take as much power as they could. And so they wanted to be able to keep their power as the priests and things like that. So they kind of sided with Rome as little as they could to keep the power that they had. And then the Zealots, they were another party. They fought the Romans until the final battle in 73 AD. And they hated Rome so much that rather than letting themselves be killed by Rome, there was a mass suicide so that they wouldn't die by a Roman sword. These guys hated Rome. They were out in the hills, and they would attack Roman soldiers as much as they could and things like that. And then you had the Essenes, which I didn't learn about until a couple years ago, probably a few years ago. They were a group that was also part of the priestly family, but they moved. They did not want anything to do with Rome or with the temple, and they left. They went out to the wilderness, and like there was a group of them around the Dead Sea, and that's how we get the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were just a ton of writing. So these Essenes, they really valued scripture, and they would copy it over and over and read it and things like that. They would have their own communities out there in the wilderness. And then the other group, the other party, was the Pharisees, which we see a lot more of in Scripture. Their response to Rome and the Greco-Roman culture was to say no to all of that and to follow the law as strictly as possible, especially the oral law. So not necessarily the laws in the Torah and the Old Testament, but rather the oral law, which was a bunch of laws added on top of that. And the goal was a good goal, so that way they didn't break the laws in the Bible, in the Hebrew scriptures. But you see with Jesus, it caused a lot of problems in Jesus. If you see Jesus going against the Pharisees and their teachings, he's going against the oral law, not the Hebrew Bible. And so they were big into scripture. They loved their scripture and their law, and they were very strict when it comes to that. And so let's see. I guess I'll talk about 70 AD and then pass it to you. So in 70 AD, the temple was destroyed, like we talked about. And so at that point, a lot of things changed. They did not have the temple to make their sacrifices and things like that. And at this point, of course, they were separating the Jews and the Gentiles. The Christian Jews, they were obviously joined the church and things like that. They were separating themselves from the non-Christian Jews. And so there was a big separation when it comes to the Jews and either believing Jews or unbelieving Jews when it comes to Jesus. And so then at 70 AD, the Sadducees, that group was pretty much completely wiped out or irrelevant because they were in charge of the temple and there was no more temple. So they were goners. And then you had the Zealots. Again, I talked about them. They were killed because they were going against Rome, and so they were wiped out. And then the Essenes, they were pretty much wiped out by Rome as well, or they would separate and join other groups, kind of. They would, their communities were disrupted by all of the chaos going on. And then the Pharisees, they kind of led the way into the next era of Judaism. Since they valued scripture so much and they were very much against Rome and they valued prayers and all those things, these things that you didn't need a temple for, when there was no temple, they were like, okay, we have the blueprint. We know what to do. We can do this even without the temple. And so they kind of led the way into the next phase of Judaism, which would be the rabbinic period. And so the rabbinic period basically was Judaism without a temple. And so there was no more sacrifices. What they did was they put so much emphasis on scripture and observance to the law, which makes a lot of sense because the previous time that the temple was destroyed, back with the first temple when the Babylonians came through, after the exile, the people turned to scripture like crazy. They thought we weren't following the laws good enough, and that's why we were in exile. And so the same thing kind of happens. The temple is destroyed, and what do? They turn to scripture, and they put study of scripture at like the highest level. And so they would have certain prayers and certain studies of scriptures that would replace certain sacrifices. And so prayer would take the place of sacrifices often, and the study of scripture would kind of be the main thing that they would do. So then the rabbis ended up taking kind of most of the power, and the rabbis are basically like descendants from the Pharisees, from that party. Rabbi means teacher. Jesus is called rabbi some in scripture. But that's basically like the future of Judaism turned to following the rabbis. They would like make comments on scripture and things like that. And study of scripture, prayers took the place of sacrifices. And I guess that's pretty much the basis of the rabbinic Judaism. You want to take it from here?
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm going to touch on the Mishnah and the Talmud. So, for those of you that don't know, the Mishnah is a written record of oral laws and traditions that the Jewish rabbis passed down for generations and generations. So, again, how John was talking about the oral traditions, the oral laws that they would talk about, this is the written uh, example of that. So, while the Torah, it contains God's written law, the Mishnah, it explains how the Jews believe those laws should apply in their everyday life. And so it has a lot to do with living that kind of stuff out. It's not much about prayer or things of that nature. It's all about studying the Torah, studying the law. And so the Mishnah, again, is concerned mainly with the Torah. Only one place that doesn't actually talk about theology, and it's where it says that all Israel will share in the world to come. The only people who won't share in it are those who say there is no resurrection from the dead, and those who say that the Torah is not from heaven. So it's again just a source of Jewish laws, and it became the foundation for the Talmud. The Talmud is built off of the Mishnah, just kind of the rabbis, people. The rabbis, their discussions on the Mishnah and the debates that they would have, the opinions that they would have, is built off of that. So the Torah is God's written law, what He gave to Moses. The Mishnah is just written collections about the law, oral traditions about the law, and then the Talmud is the Mishnah with some added stuff as well. from the rabbis, the discussions, interpretations, and more so explaining of the law and how to apply it. Anything you'd like to add to that, John? Anything important that I missed?
Not really. I mean, they put just a huge emphasis on what the rabbis teach. But yeah, that pretty much covers those two writings, which are very important to them. So then going into some of the modern Judaism, and I'll make a quick stop at this funny story. I was doing some studying on Judaism, and I saw this. In 1626, there was very high hopes for a Messiah. There was a man named Sabbatai Zevi who was born in Smyrna, and he studied a mystical side of Jewish beliefs and gathered disciples around him. And he wandered from place to place in the Middle East. He married a woman named Sarah who claimed that she was destined to marry the Messiah. That's some high hopes right there. And he was declared to be the Messiah by his disciples, and the Jewish hope was raised all over the world. They were hearing about this guy, this Messiah is going to be awesome. He's here finally, woohoo! And so he was declared to be the Messiah by his disciples. And then, but in 1665, the Messiah, this guy, entered Constantinople with the goal of dethroning the Sultan of Turkey, so a Muslim. He was imprisoned and given the options of converting to Islam or dying, and the Messiah converted to Islam. So that ended the hopes for a Messiah for a really long time. And of course it would. That would be very disappointing all over the world.
Mm.
Your Jewish Messiah suddenly becomes a Muslim. Not very awesome. But things like that happened throughout Judaism. There would be hopes for a Messiah, but then obviously it wouldn't work out. And then, so the Jewish groups would often get persecuted. That's been something that's happened throughout their history over and over and over. And because of that, they were a very tight-knit group. There would be like communities of Jews, and they kind of had their own space. They didn't want to kind of go into the outside world. But then, with the help of the French and American revolutions supporting equality of everyone under the law, Jewish communities began to join the outside world. So that was a huge step for them because they were very secluded and kind of kept to themselves in a way. But then they got to the outside world. And then, let's see, Reform Judaism. In 1843, a group of German Jewish leaders met to discuss the changes that they felt needed to be made to Judaism and since its entrance into Western culture. And they came up with these three declarations. They said, one, there is a continuation in the development of Judaism. Two, the Talmud has no authority for the modern Jew. And three, we seek no Messiah, and we know no homeland but the land of our birth. And so at this point, they were using Hebrew a ton less. Synagogues were called temples, and kosher food laws were not stressed. So there was just so much reform that it didn't even look the same. Like if you looked at Judaism from the first century and Judaism during the 1800s, totally different. They were just not really following what Judaism had always taught. There was just huge reform and things like that. Things change as we go forward.
Yeah, and to get to some current practices of the Orthodox Judaism. So it is the largest group of the Jews today. So they try to maintain biblical and Talmudic Judaism by keeping the kosher laws, a strict observance of the Sabbath, separating men and women during worship, while both covering their heads, and using Hebrew during worship as well. So they're a lot more traditional in those senses than the Reform Judaism. The Reform Judaism is the main group in America today. So if we come across somebody, that's likely who you will be coming across. They try to be as modern as possible with their worship being on Friday evenings, they sit together in their services. They call synagogues temples and use Hebrew a lot less frequently. So um, you will not hear much Hebrew during those services as you would the others. Orthodox and conservative. Conservative Judaism is a response to Reformed Judaism. They are in the middle of Orthodox and Reformed when it comes to their practices and just kind of how they live out their beliefs. They use more vernacular than Hebrew. Um, uh, they worship on Saturday mornings, wear head coverings, have a greater concern for the study of Torah and rabbinical material, and they keep the laws of the Sabbath and kosher. And then finally, we have Reconstructionist Judaism. This began in the 1930s, and they see Judaism not only as a religion, but also a culture. So they believe that one should study and experience both their religion and culture. Anything you want to touch on those, John, or should we get to their core beliefs?
Yeah, we can get to the core beliefs. Basically, there's a bunch of variety. Some obviously follow everything, some follow nothing, some follow in the middle. Um,
Hmm.
that's that's pretty much sums that up.
Yeah, and you're going to
But
get that pretty much with every large religion, every
yeah,
religion that you can see across the globe.
yeah,
Christianity has it, Catholicism has it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but that, I mean, I guess that covers a lot of the beliefs. Did you have anything else for the beliefs as well?
Um, no, I mean, they're like you said, they're monotheistic. They believe in one God, similar to us. Their scripture is the Old Testament, the Tanakh, which is just uh, the law, the Torah, the prophets, and writings. Yeah, I mean, we touched on most of it. They're very covenantal. They believe and hold tightly to the promises of God, and um, still waiting on a lot of those promises as well. Typically, very traditional. Um, you typically strict with the law, and yeah, still waiting on their Messiah. I think that about touches it.
Yeah.
Hits all the points. Well, for their Messiah, I guess we'll say what they believe he's going to look like, what he's going to come. So there's a few kind of descriptions that are commonly believed. We touched on one that he's going to be a descendant of David. They believe it will gather Israel together, kind of unify them all, bring world peace, restore justice, and rebuild or restore the temple that is destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, they're waiting on that. They, unlike us, they do not believe that Jesus was the Messiah, and so they're still waiting. And they believe that one dude was
Yeah.
till he converted. But yeah.
Yeah. That didn't work out. Yeah, but then going into kind of some of the differences. Of course, we believe that Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament and the prophecies and all the things that they're still waiting on. We believe that Jesus fulfilled that he was the fulfillment to the land promises and the offspring and all the things promised to Abraham, all the things promised to Moses with the covenant with Israel, that we are the kingdom of priests. And so really, I mean, Jesus, he's the difference. The difference is that we
Hmm.
believe that Jesus was the fulfillment. And I don't know, do you have anything else to say about that?
Um, yeah, I mean, that again, that's the big difference. Obviously, that ties into salvation. So the way that we
Yeah.
believe you're saved, obviously, we believe that is through faith in Jesus Christ. They believe it's faithfulness to the law, faithfulness to God's covenant, obedience to the law as well. Um, I mean, they reject the Trinity. We believe in the Trinity. We follow that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I'd say because it is very similar with our history because we're kind of just a branch. We kind of just split ways after a
Yeah.
certain point. So there are not a whole lot of differences when it comes to our faith, um, ex- other than just the practical practices. But when it comes to the core belief, yeah, I'd say we pretty much hit it.
Yeah. And I think the future episodes we have will have a lot more to say about the differences,
Yeah, the differences.
because yeah, it's really wrapped up in just we believe Jesus is the Messiah, and everything that
Mhm.
goes along with that, of course, is a ton. So it's not just that, but that's really it. So then going into kind of how would we witness to a practicing Jew? And my thought is the Bible is simply biblical. How did they do it in the first century when that's exactly what they were doing? Paul, Peter, going to these Jews in front of these people, and how did they do it? They talked about Jesus being the fulfillment of everything and how everything led to this moment. I mean, you'd see when Stephen or any of the apostles would start talking to a group of Jews, what did they do? They would go through the history and talk about the history of the Jewish people and how it all led to the Son of God, Jesus, dying on the cross and raising again. And so that's how I would do it. I think I'd be careful not to kind of diminish their beliefs when it comes to the Old Testament, because like I want to place a value on the Old Testament, not just like,
Mhm.
no, that doesn't matter anymore because Jesus, but actually show them that I care about their scriptures and that I care about them a ton because it's Jesus who fulfills them. And so I feel like I would probably take that route. What do you think, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, really, it's just focusing on Jesus as the fulfillment, because that is, again, the difference between our religion. That's where the break kind of comes, and then everything after that will fall into place as far as, the practicality of how we practice our faith, our religion. Um, yeah, it's just all preaching about Jesus being the fulfillment. Uh, Again, just be weary of, like John was saying, like disrespecting the law, disrespecting things of that nature, because obviously that's gonna just push him away. It's gonna put up a wall immediately, and it's gonna start the argument that is not needed, not necessary. For you to really help walk somebody to faith, there kind of has to be a perfect storm. It has to be, you know, um, God already has to be working in their heart. So obviously, go
Yeah.
into it prayerfully, go into it, um, just praying a lot for that whole moment during the conversation. Be praying, be listening to them, be engaged in what they have to say,
Hmm.
um but then ultimately just keep pointing to Jesus as the fulfillment of everything, because that's what he is. Everything that Israel failed in, Jesus fulfilled. And so looking at all the scriptures that prophesy about Jesus and pointing them to how Jesus fulfilled them. So be studying up on those if you need to. Um, and then just be continually pointing back to Jesus, because that, again, is where our religions break, because we share the same history, but up until that point of Jesus is where we separate. So everything has to go through that lens,
Yeah.
because there's not a whole lot to really change their mind on, because we all they believe in scripture up until the point of New Testament. So we're not trying to argue whether the scripture is inerrant or if it's false, if God wrote it or if man wrote it, because they believe all those things. The only difference is that they don't believe Jesus is the Messiah. It's something that they're looking for. They just need to be convinced that he is the Messiah. And so that's
Yeah.
what we do. And again, everything that, like, ultimately God is the one who sees it through. So we just plant the seed, we do what we can. Um, but don't feel discouraged if you have a conversation and it didn't go well. Who knows, what anything you say could just stick in their heart, and God, waters it and sees it through, and that seed becomes fruitful. You may never see it, may never see the fruit of it, but every encounter matters, even if it seems super unfruitful. Just do what you can in the moment. Do as you feel led by the Spirit. Um, and yeah, again, don't try to win the argument. Just try to point them to Jesus and let Him take care of the rest.
Yeah. Sounds good to me.
All right. So that wraps it up, John.
I think so. Yeah, that's our first one talking about Judaism. We'll have more to talk about probably with some other ones because it's not as known.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that wraps it up.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll definitely have more to talk about in the coming episodes. Judaism is just very similar to our faith, so there's not a whole lot other than that period of time that's not really talked about to, just bring up and go over. So, yeah, it'll be fun as we get into the more lesser known religions. But yeah, well, thank you guys for listening to the Simply Biblical podcast. Don't forget to follow us on whatever streaming platform you guys use. Give us a like if you're enjoying the content. It really helps us get the podcast out to more people. Helps us just expand our reach. So if you guys have any questions, any topics you'd like for us to speak about, you can contact us at Simply Biblical Podcast on Instagram and also simplybiblicalpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening to the Simply Biblical Podcast, where our goal is that all people would know Christ through the study of His Word. We'll see you next week.